On the evening of Friday, September 5th, 1997, at 6 o'clock, a television camera was switched on inside a small wood-paneled room at Buckingham Palace. The Queen was already seated. She wore black. A single sheet of prepared text lay on the desk in front of her. Through the window behind her left shoulder, the crowds gathered along the mall were visible. Thousands of people who had spent the past 5 days grieving in public for a woman the palace had spent the past year trying to remove from the royal family. The flowers at the gates of Kensington Palace were 6 feet deep. The country was not mourning quietly. The country was furious. And now the most private sovereign in modern British history was about to do something she had never done before. Speak to the nation about her own family's failure in a voice that did not sound like hers. The woman Elizabeth was about to honor had lost the style of Her Royal Highness 13 months earlier. She had been formally repositioned outside the royal circle, stripped of the institutional status that the palace guarded more jealously than any crown jewel. And yet it was the sovereign, not the ex-daughter-in-law, who now sat behind a desk being told when to look at the camera. The private reality of the House of Windsor had never been further from the public image than it was in that room at that hour. This is the story of how a 20-year-old bride became the one problem the most powerful family in Britain could not solve, and what it cost every person who tried. That broadcast, 5 minutes of carefully measured language from a woman who had spent 45 years on the throne without once breaking the emotional code of her office, was the end of something that had been building for 16 years. It started in 1981 with a shy young aristocrat in a wedding dress, watched by 750 million people. And it ended with a sovereign compelled to speak in the Register of Feeling, which was never her language because the woman she was mourning had made it the only language the country would accept. But to understand how Elizabeth II ended up behind that desk in the Chinese dining room, forced to borrow the emotional vocabulary of the very person she had spent more than a decade trying to contain, you have to go back much further than the crash in Paris. You have to go back to the institution itself. What it demanded of the people who carried its name, what it could not tolerate in those who defied its rhythms, and what it believed it was getting when it welcomed Diana Frances Spencer into the family. This is the story of two women and two incompatible ideas of what the British monarchy owed the people who watched it. It is the story of a collision that lasted 16 years, played out across palaces, television studios, tabloid front pages, a House of Commons chamber, an interview that was obtained through deception, a minefield in Angola, and a tunnel beneath the Seine. It ran from the most watched wedding of the 20th century to the most emotionally convulsive royal death since the abdication crisis, and it changed the terms on which the House of Windsor would speak to the country forever. To understand how that happened, you have to begin not with Diana, but with the machine she married into, and the woman who ran it. The House of Windsor, by the time Diana Spencer entered it, was not simply a family. It was a system of governance built on restraint, and the restraint had a logic that stretched back decades. Elizabeth II had been queen since the 6th of February 1952, when her father, George VI, died at Sandringham, and the 25-year-old princess became sovereign while staying at a lodge in Kenya. She was crowned in Westminster Abbey in June 1953, before an audience of millions watching the first televised coronation in British history, and from that day forward she had embodied a particular theory of monarchy, that the sovereign survives by absorbing everything and expressing almost nothing. Duty was the vocabulary. Continuity was the purpose. Private feeling, however intense, was a matter for private rooms. And even there it was expected to bend toward the institutional interest. The crown endured not by being loved, though Elizabeth was loved deeply and widely, but by being steady. It endured by never letting the country see the mechanism strain. That discipline had been inherited at a formative age. Elizabeth's father, George VI, had taken the throne in December 1936 only because his elder brother, Edward VIII, had placed private desire above dynastic obligation and abdicated to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. The abdication crisis was the defining trauma of the modern Windsor dynasty. It proved that the monarchy could be endangered not by war or revolution, but by the unchecked personal choices of the sovereign. That feeling, left undisciplined, could shatter the constitutional compact in a season. Elizabeth was 10 years old when that crisis unfolded. She watched her shy, stammering father assume a burden he had never expected, and she watched the cost it extracted from him. George VI died at 56, exhausted. The lesson was seared into the Windsor consciousness before Elizabeth ever wore the crown. Personal emotion, left uncontrolled, was an existential threat. The institution came first. The institution always came first. And the people inside it either accepted that hierarchy or became the problem. By the early 1980s, Elizabeth had been on the throne for nearly 30 years, and the system she presided over had calcified into something formidable and deeply specific. Buckingham Palace was the administrative theater of monarchy. 775 rooms, 800 staff members, a daily machinery of audiences, state papers, investitures, and receptions that ran with the precision of a military operation and the emotional temperature of a well ordered government department. Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands was the family's summer retreat, but even there the rituals were prescribed. The stalking, the shooting, the formal dinners, the long walks that were as much test of fitness and temperament as they were recreation. Sandringham in Norfolk was the Christmas and New Year residence, with its own deeply grooved routines. Nothing inside these houses was casual. The monarchy's private life was governed by the same principle that governed its public life: form over feeling, always. Philip reinforced the code. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, born on the 10th of June 1921 on the island of Corfu into the displaced Greek and Danish royal houses, had been raised across Europe in circumstances that were royal in name and frequently unstable in practice. His father had been exiled. His mother had suffered a serious breakdown. His childhood was itinerant, marked by the kind of loss and disruption that could produce either fragility or toughness. Philip chose toughness. He chose it with a severity that became his defining characteristic: the bluntness, the impatience with complaint, the belief that hardship was something to be endured rather than discussed. He had married Princess Elizabeth in 1947, surrendered his own naval career and his own name to the institution she embodied, and spent the decades since as the monarchy's hard edge. He was not cruel in the cartoonish sense. He could be warm, funny, loyal, and fiercely protective of his family, but he had no patience for what he perceived as emotional weakness. And in a household that would soon contain a young woman desperate for reassurance, his model of stoic discipline would function less as support than as another wall. There is one more element of the system that must be understood before Diana enters the story, because it is the element that would ultimately destroy the old arrangement: television. The coronation in 1953 had been the first great demonstration of the monarchy's relationship with broadcasting, and it had been managed on the palace's terms: reverent, ceremonial, mediated through deference. By the 1980s, that deference was eroding. The tabloid press had grown bolder, hungrier, less willing to observe the old gentleman's agreements that had once shielded the royal family from intrusive coverage. Television had shifted from ceremonial record to daily scrutiny. The monarchy's old survival mechanism, mystique sustained by distance, was being undermined by a media environment that rewarded intimacy, personality, and emotional legibility. Elizabeth understood the threat in institutional terms. She had spent decades calibrating how much of the private royal world could be revealed without endangering its authority. What she had not anticipated was that the institution was about to bring into the family a woman who understood the new media landscape instinctively, who communicated through feeling rather than formality, and who would prove over 16 years that the emotional half of monarchy was now more powerful than the constitutional half. Diana did not create that shift, but she was the first person inside the royal family to exploit it, not with calculation, at least not initially, but with the sheer force of her emotional authenticity in a world that was hungry for it. That was the code Diana Spencer was about to enter. And there is something worth understanding about the world that produced her, because she was not, in any social sense, an outsider. Diana Frances Spencer was born on the 1st of July 1961 at Park House on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, not merely near the royal family's country residence, but on its grounds, in a house leased from the crown. The Spencers were Old English aristocracy, rooted at Althorp in Northamptonshire for more than 5 centuries. Their lineage woven through the fabric of the country's landed establishment in ways that predated the Windsors themselves. Althorp was not a minor country house. It was a great English estate. More than 13,000 acres, a Grade 1 listed mansion filled with centuries of art and furniture, a park designed in the 18th century. The Spencers had been courtiers, politicians, and grandees for generations. They had served kings and married into the aristocratic bloodlines that formed the invisible architecture of the English power. Diana's father, the 8th Earl Spencer, had served as equerry to both George VI and Elizabeth II, a position of trusted proximity to the sovereign. Her maternal grandmother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, was a close companion of the Queen Mother and a woman thoroughly embedded in the social world of the court. Diana did not enter the royal family from the margins. She entered it from the exact social stratum the institution had always drawn its brides from, the old aristocratic families who understood or were supposed to understand the rules. That pedigree was precisely the point. It was why the match seemed so safe. That is part of what made the collision so devastating. The system did not believe it was importing danger when it approved Diana as a match for the Prince of Wales. It believed it was importing stability. She was young, she was English, she was aristocratic, she was photogenic, she had no complicated romantic past, and she came from a family that already knew how the royal calendar worked. On paper, she was the perfect institutional repair, a bride who could refresh the image of the monarchy, produce heirs, and settle the restless question of Charles's future. The logic was flawless. The psychology was catastrophic. Because Diana Spencer, for all her social pedigree, was not arriving from emotional solidity. Her childhood had been shaped by rupture. Her parents' marriage, John Spencer, then Viscount Althorp, and Frances Roche, had collapsed when Diana was 6 years old, and the divorce that followed in 1969 was bitter, contested, and public enough to mark every child in the family. Her mother left the household. Custody was awarded to her father, an outcome that in the late 1960s required a mother to have been found considerably at fault, and the fallout was not quiet. Diana grew up shuttling between Park House and her mother's new life, absorbing the particular damage of a household broken by adult choices that no child could influence or repair. She attended preparatory schools and then West Heath, a girls' school in Kent, where she was remembered as kind, sporty, not academic, and already possessed of the instinctive warmth that would later make her the most emotionally legible royal figure of her generation. But beneath the warmth was something the institution never properly reckoned with, a deep, unmet hunger for affection, a fear of abandonment, and a need to be chosen and to matter that no amount of aristocratic poise could fully conceal. There is something about that mismatch worth sitting with for a moment. The qualities that made Diana perfect for the role, her openness, her emotional transparency, her instinctive ability to make people feel seen, were the same qualities that made her impossible for the institution to absorb on its own terms. The monarchy needed a princess who could perform feeling in public and contain it in private. Diana could do the first part better than anyone the crown had ever produced. She could not do the second part at all. And the system, accustomed to decades of emotional discipline under Elizabeth's reign, had no way of recognizing the difference until it was far too late. Charles Philip Arthur George, Prince of Wales, was born on the 14th of November, 1948, the eldest son of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip, and from the first hours of his life, he existed inside a paradox that would define everything that followed. He was the heir to the greatest constitutional inheritance in the English-speaking world, and he was a child whose parents were defined more by public duty than by private tenderness. Philip's model of fatherhood was brisk, physical, and demanding, modeled, perhaps inevitably, on the same toughness that had carried him through his own disrupted childhood. Elizabeth's model of motherhood was shaped by the fact that she became queen when Charles was 3 years old, and from that point forward, the crown's requirements governed her time, her attention, and her emotional availability in ways that no amount of private affection could fully offset. She loved her children. That was not in question. But she was the sovereign first and the mother second, and Charles, sensitive and searching, felt the hierarchy. He grew up introspective and lonely in ways that royal life could cushion with privilege, but could not cure with warmth. He was sent, at Philip's insistence, to Gordonstoun, Philip's old school in the remote Scottish Highlands, where the ethos was cold showers, early morning runs, physical endurance, and the suppression of exactly the kind of emotional vulnerability Charles possessed in abundance. He later described his time there in terms that left almost no ambiguity about the misery it caused. He was not Gordonstone's kind of boy, and Gordonstone was not kind to boys who were not its kind. He found intellectual companionship at Trinity College, Cambridge, and later a sense of purpose and structure in the Royal Navy. But what he wanted most, someone who understood his interior life, who could offer ease rather than performance, who met him with warmth that did not need to be earned through institutional compliance. He did not find inside the systems his family had chosen for him. He found it instead in Camilla Shand. They had met in 1971 through mutual friends, and by every credible account, the connection was immediate, mutual, and temperamentally rooted in a way that Charles's later relationships were not. Camilla was confident, funny, irreverent, unintimidated by royal proximity, and she understood country life, horses, and the particular social landscape of the English upper classes with a naturalness Charles found irresistible. She was not performing ease. She was ease. But Camilla was not. In the institutional calculus of the early 1970s, a suitable bride for the heir to the throne. She had a romantic history. She was not a virgin. The palace did not approve, and the mechanisms of disapproval in the Windsor system were quiet but decisive. Not a prohibition spoken aloud, but a withdrawal of encouragement, a redirection of the heir's attention, a reliance on the assumption that duty would eventually overrule desire. While Charles was away with the Navy, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973, a cavalry officer from exactly the sort of well-connected military family that populated the social world around the monarchy. And the question of what might have been became a wound that Charles carried into the next decade and ruinously into his marriage. That wound is the structural fault line beneath everything that followed. It did not heal with Diana. It did not heal because Charles did not fully leave Camilla behind. Their friendship continued, their emotional bond endured, and the boundaries between past attachment and present loyalty were never clean. And it did not heal because the institution, having failed to secure the match that suited Charles's heart, proceeded to arrange one that suited its requirements and assumed the heart would follow. It did not. That assumption and that dynastic logic could override emotional reality was the foundational miscalculation of the entire saga. Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, born on the 4th of August 1900, stood as the silent standard against which every royal woman in the family was measured. She had married into the House of Windsor in 1923, endured the abdication crisis that thrust her reluctant husband onto the throne, supported George VI through the Second World War with a composure that became legendary and outlived him by half a century, dying in 2002 at the age of 101. Her method was the old method: composure, performance, stamina, charm, and above all, the understanding that one simply did not let the strain show. She was not Diana's antagonist in any direct sense, and to cast her as such would be to misread the dynamics. But she was the embodiment of a female royal ideal, the wife who absorbs, endures, and never breaks public form, that Diana could never replicate and was never psychologically equipped to sustain. Her presence in the family was less a character in the active drama and more a looming reminder of what the institution expected its women to endure in silence and what it rewarded them with if they did: longevity, affection, and the quiet power that comes from having outlasted every crisis without ever once appearing to notice it. Prince William Arthur Philip Louis was born on the 21st of June, 1982, at St. Mary's Hospital, Paddington. Prince Henry Charles Albert David Harry followed on the 15th of September, 1984, at the same hospital. Those two births did what the institution most needed them to do. They secured the line. The succession now ran from Elizabeth to Charles to William, and the future of the crown was, in dynastic terms, assured for another generation. But the boys also became something the institution had not planned for. the emotional center of Diana's life, the living stakes in every negotiation between their mother and the palace, and eventually the two people whose well being both sides would invoke to justify almost every decision they made against each other. William was the heir, Harry was the spare. Both were children growing up inside a marriage that was already failing before the younger one could walk. And both would carry the consequences of what happened between their parents into adulthood in ways that neither the palace nor Diana could foresee, and that neither could prevent. Diana's brother, Charles Edward Maurice Spencer, born on the 20th of May 1964, matters to this story in the ways that would not become fully clear for years. 3 years younger than Diana, he grew up inside the same fractured Spencer household, inherited the earldom and Althorp when their father died in 1992, and occupied a position that was peculiarly significant in the saga. He was Diana's closest family witness, the person who shared her childhood damage, and the man who would later be manipulated into granting a BBC journalist access to his sister, a deception that would help precipitate the final collapse of Diana's position inside the royal system. He was also the man who would stand in Westminster Abbey after her death and deliver a eulogy that functioned as an indictment of the institution she had married into. But all of that lay ahead. In the early 1980s, he was simply her younger brother, watching from the Spencer side as his sister was absorbed into a machine neither of them fully understood. The wedding itself had been spectacle on a scale the modern world had rarely witnessed. On the 29th of July, 1981, Diana Spencer walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral before a congregation of 3,500 and a global television audience estimated at 750 million people. The dress was ivory silk taffeta with a 25-foot train. The crowd stretched from the cathedral steps to the balcony at Buckingham Palace, where the kiss was broadcast to the world. The nation celebrated as though the monarchy had solved its generational problem in a single morning. The heir married, the bride beloved, the future of the crown vivid and warm and young. And for a time, the illusion held. The early photographs showed a family that looked like renewal. At Diana, radiant with the kind of public warmth the monarchy had not generated since the coronation, Charles performing the role of proud husband and father, the boys small and golden-haired and perfect for the cameras. There were moments of genuine happiness in those years, and the script of this story does not work if they are denied. Diana loved being a mother. She was instinctive with babies, tactile and playful and unguarded in a way that broke every protocol about how royal children were supposed to be raised. She insisted on choosing the boys' schools herself. She took them on outings that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Theme parks, burger restaurants, the cinema. She was trying, in the small domestic spaces she could control, to give William and Harry the emotional warmth she had not received in her own childhood. That effort was real. It was also a form of quiet rebellion against a household that measured success in duty, not tenderness. Kensington Palace became the family's London base. Apartments 8 and 9, a grand but not quite intimate set of rooms inside the palace complex, where Diana tried to build something resembling a normal domestic life within the most abnormal domestic circumstances imaginable. Highgrove House in Gloucestershire was Charles's preferred countryside retreat, the place where he could pursue his passions for architecture, organic farming, and the rural rhythms Diana found increasingly alienating. She did not share his love of Highgrove. She did not share his passion for long country walks, for discussions of organic agriculture, for the quiet, reflective pace of life he craved after years of royal performance. What she increasingly suspected was that Highgrove was not merely Charles's retreat from London, it was his retreat toward Camilla. That suspicion, corrosive, intermittent, impossible to fully verify and impossible to fully dismiss, ate at the marriage from inside. Balmoral and Sandringham, the Queen's private estates in Scotland and Norfolk, were the seasonal proving grounds where the extended family gathered and where Diana discovered, slowly and then with mounting desperation, that the rituals she was expected to perform, the stalking, the shooting weekends, the controlled silences of family dinners, the long hours of structured leisure that were never truly leisure, were not invitations to belong. They were tests, and she was failing them. The royal family at Balmoral operated on rules that had been refined over generations: when to speak, when not to speak, what constituted acceptable conversation, what constituted emotional excess. Diana's warmth, her spontaneity, her need for connection, the very qualities the public adored, registered inside those Scottish drawing rooms as disruption. She was too much, too emotional, too needy, too visible in her unhappiness. The family did not say this to her directly. They communicated it through silence, through scheduling, through the particular cruelty of being surrounded by people and feeling entirely alone. The first major royal tour told the story in miniature, and it told it early. In March 1983, Charles and Diana visited Australia and New Zealand with the 9-month-old William, and the public response was unlike anything the modern monarchy had generated. Crowds surged toward Diana. Cameras followed Diana. The emotional energy of every engagement, every walkabout, every hospital visit and civic reception centered on Diana. Charles was the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, the constitutional future of the country. And the crowds wanted his wife, not out of disrespect for him, but because Diana offered something the institution had never provided, and Charles, for all his qualities, could not replicate: warmth without distance, feeling without formality, a royal figure who reached across the velvet rope and touched people's hands and meant it. That asymmetry, the public choosing the princess over the prince, was not simply a matter of personal vanity or marital rivalry. It was structurally dangerous in the ways that only became fully visible later. The monarchy is designed to orbit the sovereign and the heir. When the emotional gravity shifts to someone else inside the family, someone who is neither the head nor the future head of state, the system loses its center. Elizabeth, watching from London, could read the institutional implications, even if she did not yet grasp the personal ones. Charles, standing on the opposite side of every crowd from the wife they had come to see, felt the imbalance as humiliation, a humiliation deepened by the knowledge that his own mother's institution had chosen this woman precisely because she would be popular, and now her popularity was eclipsing him. Diana felt it as validation, the one form of reassurance the private architecture of her marriage was failing to supply. And behind the public enchantment, the private reality was already darkening. Diana's struggles with bulimia had begun before the wedding and intensified after it, driven by the relentless combination of emotional isolation, marital unhappiness, and the knowledge that her body was one of the most scrutinized objects in the world. She was isolated inside a household that prized composure above all else. Married to a man she increasingly suspected had never emotionally left Camilla, surrounded by staff and courtiers whose loyalty ran to the institution rather than to her, and subject to a level of tabloid scrutiny that transformed every private moment of distress into a potential front page photograph. The eating disorder was not a footnote to her biography. It was the body's expression of a life that demanded constant public performance, while offering almost nothing in the way of private emotional sustenance. She was 21 years old, living in a palace, married to the future king, the mother of the future heir, one of the most photographed women on earth, and she was drowning. The people around her could see the symptoms. What they could not do, within the grammar of the institution, was address the cause. The institution's response to Diana's distress was not in most instances actively cruel. It was something more corrosive than cruelty. It was inadequate. Protocol where reassurance was needed, scheduling where tenderness was needed, silence where explanation was needed. The system had survived for decades by treating private difficulty as a matter to be managed, contained, and if possible, rendered invisible. Diana's pain did not fit the management model. It was too raw, too visible, too emotionally charged for a system whose operating principle was that feeling must never disrupt form. And nobody inside the palace, not Elizabeth, whose instinct was always to trust the system she had inherited, not Philip, whose response to emotional distress was to recommend discipline, not the courtiers, whose training was in logistics rather than psychology, not the Queen's private secretary, whose concern was the diary and the public schedule, appeared to understand that the management model was itself the problem. They saw a young woman struggling to adapt to royal life, They did not see that royal life, as it was structured, was incapable of providing what she needed to survive inside it. By the mid 1980s, the Wales household looked from the outside like the most successful royal family unit in a generation. Two healthy sons, a globally adored princess, a prince preparing, however impatiently, for the throne. The succession was secure. The monarchy was more visible, more popular, and more emotionally resonant with ordinary people than it had been since the coronation. The public had embraced Diana with a fervor that no amount of palace stage management could have manufactured. And the photographs from those years, the young family on the steps of Kensington Palace, Diana laughing with children in the hospital wards, the boys tumbling on the palace lawn, told a story the institution wanted the world to believe. But Diana's public magnetism had already begun to overshadow the air, and the very success of the Wales household had created a dangerous asymmetry that the crown did not yet know how to correct. The princess was becoming the emotional future of the monarchy before the monarchy had decided what to do with her. That stability would last barely another half decade, and then it shattered. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. It shattered slowly at first, the way these things always do inside families, where the facade is worth more than the feeling. For a few more years, the public surface held. And in fairness to the people inside it, the surface was not entirely false. There were genuine pleasures in the Wales household between the mid 1980s and the end of the decade, and to deny them would be to tell a simpler story than the one that actually happened. Diana's gift with people was not a performance, it was a capacity, instinctive, physical, and almost impossible to teach. She walked into hospital wards and held the hands of patients whom the medical establishment still treated with caution and the tabloids treated with fear. In April 1987, she opened the United Kingdom's first purpose built ward for AIDS patients at the Middlesex Hospital in London. And the photograph that emerged, Diana shaking the hand of a man with AIDS without gloves, without flinching, became one of the defining images of her public life. That image mattered not because it was staged, but because it was not. The gesture was natural to her. She understood, without being told, a human touch in a moment of isolation was more powerful than any institutional statement, and that a princess willing to touch what the rest of the country was afraid of, could shift the entire emotional register of how a disease was discussed. The monarchy had spent decades communicating through formality. Diana communicated through contact, and the public watching understood the difference. Through the late 1980s, her calendar of engagements expanded and her confidence grew. She became patron to charities working with homelessness, addiction, leprosy, and children's illness. She visited hospices. She sat with the dying. She held babies in pediatric wards with the kind of unforced tenderness that cameras loved precisely because it was not manufactured for them. The institution had expected her to be ornamental, a photogenic companion to the heir who would generate positive coverage and produce heirs of her own. Instead, she was becoming something the monarchy had never quite produced before, a figure whose moral authority derived not from her constitutional position, but from her emotional authenticity. She was not a head of state. She was not a future sovereign. She was a woman in a tiara who made people in the worst moments of their lives feel seen. And that form of authority, though the palace did not yet understand this, was becoming more powerful in the television age than any amount of constitutional legitimacy. At home, the rhythms of family life continued. William started at Wetherby, a pre-preparatory school in Notting Hill, in 1987. Harry followed. Diana was fiercely attentive to the boys' daily lives in the ways that broke with royal convention. She arranged her schedule around school drop-offs, insisted on being present for sports days, took them to amusement parks and fast food restaurants and ordinary London streets where they could experience, however briefly, something other than the sealed world of the palace. She was building for them, consciously and deliberately, a version of childhood warmth that she had not received. It was by every account the part of her life that gave her the most consistent joy. The boys grounded her. They gave her a purpose that the marriage could not provide and the institution would not supply. The social world surrounding the family during these years was rendered in the old textures of upper-class English life. There were the summer stays at Balmoral, the Christmas gatherings at Sandringham, the seasonal round of Ascot and polo, and the kinds of country weekends that Charles relished and Diana endured. There were state dinners at Buckingham Palace, where Diana, seated beside foreign heads of state in the diamonds and sapphires of the Spencer tiara, performed the role of future queen consort with a fluency that impressed even her critics inside the household. She could do the job. That was never the question. The question was whether she could do the job while dying inside, and the answer, which the institution took far too long to face, was that she could not. The performance and the pain fed each other. The better she was in public, the more isolated she felt in private. The more the crowds adored her, the more the distance from Charles felt like a verdict on her worth as a wife. Charles, too, found purpose in those years, though his was directed outward rather than inward. The Prince's Trust, which he had founded in 1976, was expanding its work with disadvantaged young people across Britain. His architectural campaigns, the controversial speech at the Royal Institute of British Architects in 1984, in which he described a proposed extension to the National Gallery as a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much-loved friend, and the books and public interventions that followed, positioned him as a public intellectual with strong and sometimes polarizing views. He was a man of genuine conviction, and his commitment to organic farming at Highgrove, to environmental sustainability long before it became fashionable, and to the principles of classical architecture in the built environment was not theatrical. It was deeply felt, argued with passion, and often ahead of its time. But his public seriousness coexisted with a private emotional life that was, by the late 1980s, fundamentally dishonest. He was the Prince of Wales, the patron of dozens of organizations, the father of two young sons, the husband of the most popular woman in the world. And he was conducting an emotional relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles that had never truly ended, and that Diana, with increasing certainty and increasing agony, believed had resumed in full. Camilla's role in this period was both central and invisible. She did not appear in the newspapers. She did not attend public events with Charles. She occupied a position that the old aristocratic social world understood perfectly. The discreet companion, the woman who was present at private dinners and country weekends but absent from the official record, and that the tabloid press was beginning to suspect but could not yet prove. For Diana, Camilla was not an abstraction. She was a presence felt in Charles' absences, in the telephone calls he took in private, in the weekends at Highgrove when Diana was not invited, and Camilla, by multiple accounts, was. The marriage had three people in it. Diana knew this. The institution knew this. And the pretense that it was otherwise was becoming harder to sustain with every passing year. There is something about the coexistence of public success and private deception that is worth pausing over because it is the hinge on which the entire story turns. The late 80s were, in many ways, the peak of the Wales household's public credibility. The photographs from those years show a family that appeared to work, handsome, engaged, visible, modern. The tours were successful. The boys were healthy and growing. The monarchy's approval ratings were high. If you had looked at the House of Windsor in 1988 or 1989 and asked whether the institution was in crisis, the answer would have been no. The surface was intact. The architecture beneath it was rotting, and the rot had a name, though the public did not yet know it. Diana knew, not everything, not all at once, but enough. She knew that Charles's heart was not in the marriage and had perhaps never fully been in it. She knew that Camilla occupied a place in his emotional life that she could not displace, and that the institution would not help her confront. She knew that the warmth she poured into public engagements was partly compensation, a way of filling, through the love of strangers, the void that the private architecture of her marriage had opened inside her. And she knew, with the particular clarity of someone who has been watching closely for years, that the gap between the public image and the private reality was growing wider, and that the cost of maintaining it was being extracted almost entirely from her. The cracks, when they became visible, did not arrive as a single dramatic rupture. They accumulated, they leaked. They showed first in the body language, the couple standing slightly too far apart at public events, the smiles that did not quite reach the eyes, The separate arrivals and departures that the tabloid photographers learned to anticipate and the picture editors learned to frame. By the late 1980s, the British press was running stories about the state of the Wales marriage with increasing boldness. The body language analysis became a genre of its own. Separate schedules were noted. Rumors about Charles and Camilla were aired with diminishing caution. Whispers from inside the household, from staff, from courtiers, from the edges of the aristocratic social world where everyone knew everyone and secrets at the half-life of a London dinner party reached the newsrooms with increasing frequency. Inside the marriage, the architecture of estrangement had solidified into routine. Charles spent more time at Highgrove. Diana spent more time at Kensington Palace. They appeared together when the calendar demanded it and retreated into separate lives when it did not. The formal engagements continued, the tours, the state occasions, the charity events. But behind the diary entries, there was a marriage that had been reduced to logistics. Diana later described this period in terms that made the emotional geography painfully clear. She was a wife in name and a prisoner in practice, performing a role that the institution needed her to perform while receiving nothing in return except the title and the scrutiny that came with it. The palace's response was denial through silence. The old method, the method that had worked for Elizabeth's generation, the method built on the assumption that the press would eventually lose interest if the institution simply refused to engage. But the press did not lose interest. Diana was the biggest story in British public life, and a failing royal marriage was the biggest story within that story. The hunger was not going away, it was growing. And the people inside the palace who believed that silence would outlast scrutiny were about to discover that they were wrong, catastrophically, publicly, and irreversibly wrong. What changed the nature of the conflict entirely was the involvement of a man named Andrew Morton. Morton was a journalist, a former tabloid reporter who had moved into book-length royal coverage, and in the early 1990s he began work on a biography of Diana that would prove, when published, to be something the institution had never faced. An authorized account of the princess's suffering, told in her own voice, delivered to the public without the palace's knowledge or consent. The mechanism was carefully constructed to provide Diana with deniability. She did not sit for formal interviews. Instead, she recorded her answers to Morton's questions on audio tapes, speaking alone into a recorder, and the tapes were delivered to the journalist through an intermediary, her friend James Colthurst, a doctor who carried the cassettes back and forth in his bicycle bag, cycling through London with the most explosive royal testimony since the abdication. The arrangement was designed to be untraceable. If confronted, Diana could deny direct involvement. Morton could protect his source. And the story, and the real story, the private story, the story the palace had spent a decade containing, could reach the public without the Princess of Wales appearing to have spoken. That distinction mattered enormously inside the palace walls, where speaking to a journalist was a breach of the code so serious that it could have led to consequences Diana was not yet prepared to face. The institution's control over the royal narrative depended on the assumption that its members would never go outside the system to tell their own stories. Diana was about to destroy that assumption. The book was called Diana, Her True Story, and it was published on the 16th of June, 1992. Its impact was seismic. Morton's account revealed, in devastating and specific detail, the private reality behind the public marriage. Diana's bulimia, her acts of self-harm, her desperation, her isolation inside the royal household, her sense of being trapped in a system that would not help her, and a marriage that had been emotionally dead for years. And, most explosively, her knowledge that Charles's relationship with Camilla had never ended. The serialization in the Sunday Times began before the book's official publication, and the cues at newsagents that Sunday morning told a story of what was about to happen to the institution. The fairy tale was over. The palace could no longer pretend that the Wales marriage was merely going through a difficult patch. The private story was now public property, printed and bound and available in every bookshop in the country, and the terms of the conversation had changed irreversibly. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was something between horror and disbelief. The Queen's advisors scrambled to assess the damage. The palace's initial public position was that Diana had not cooperated with the book, a position that Diana herself maintained and that Morton, honoring the agreement, did not contradict. But the specificity of the revelation made the denial difficult to sustain. Who else could have provided these details? Who else knew about the private conversations, the specific incidents, the exact texture of Diana's suffering inside the marriage? The courtiers knew, the press knew, and the public reading the serialization over breakfast drew their own conclusions. Elizabeth's response was institutional. She did not issue a public statement. She did not confront Diana directly, at least not in the ways that have been documented with certainty. What she did was what the system had always done. She absorbed the blow and hoped that time, discretion, and the old machinery of containment would limit the damage. Philip wrote to Diana letters that have been described, depending on the source, as either supportive or blunt, attempts to understand or attempts to enforce discipline. The tone of those letters remains contested, but their existence is not. Philip, the family's enforcer, was trying to reach his daughter in law through the medium he understood, which was direct communication stripped of sentiment. Whether Diana experienced those letters as support or as another form of institutional pressure depended on which account you read, and perhaps on which day she received them. Charles saw the book as a betrayal, which, in the terms of the marriage, it was, however justified her reason, she had broken the code. The courtiers saw catastrophe. The press saw confirmation. And the palace, for perhaps the first time in Elizabeth's reign, had no playbook for what came next. What the Morton book did, in the grammar of this saga, was shift the locus of the story permanently. Before Morton, the Wales marriage was a private difficulty managed inside the palace. After Morton, it was a public narrative in which Diana had become the protagonist and the institution had become the antagonist. The British public now had access to a version of events in which the princess was a victim of a loveless marriage, of an unfeeling system, of a husband whose heart belonged elsewhere. And the system that was supposed to protect her had failed. That version was not entirely fair. Human marriages are rarely reducible to a single victim and a single villain, and Diana's account, however compelling, was one perspective on a situation that contained many. But the version was emotionally irresistible, and it was told with a specificity that the palace's habitual silence could not rebut. Diana had given the public her story. The palace had given the public nothing. And in the court of public sympathy, the party that speaks first and speaks with feeling wins every time. The summer of 1992 was a descent. The book's revelations were compounded by the publication of a secretly recorded telephone conversation between Diana and a close friend, James Gilby, a tape that became known in the press by a name the tabloids gave it, a name derived from the term of endearment Gilby used. That recording, whatever its provenance, added another layer of exposure to a marriage that was already hemorrhaging privacy. Charles, too, was exposed. A recorded telephone conversation between the prince and Camilla, intimate, embarrassing, undeniable, surfaced in the press and laid bare, in terms that no public relations operation could manage, the nature of the relationship Diana had been describing. The monarchy's worst year in living memory was now fully underway. Elizabeth herself would later describe 1992 in a speech at the Guildhall on the 24th of November as her annus horribilis, a phrase that captured, with the characteristic restraint of a woman who had never been comfortable expressing difficulty in public, the scale of what had befallen her family and her institution. She delivered that speech with a heavy cold, her voice strained, standing in the Guildhall just 4 days after a fire had swept through Windsor Castle, destroying or damaging more than 100 rooms in a blaze that burned for 15 hours and seemed, to a country already watching the monarchy fracture, like a metaphor the scriptwriters of history could not have improved upon. The year had already brought the separation of Princess Anne from Captain Mark Phillips, the separation of the Duke and Duchess of the York, accompanied by photographs of the Duchess that caused acute embarrassment to the palace, and the continuing public disintegration of the Wales marriage. The monarchy was cracking on multiple fronts. Elizabeth, 66 years old, was enduring a year that tested the institution more severely than anything since the abdication. The formal separation came on the 9th of December, 1992, and it came not through a family announcement or a palace statement, but through the mouth of the Prime Minister. John Major, who had been in office since 1990, rose in the House of Commons that Wednesday afternoon and read a prepared statement to a House that understood, even through the careful constitutional language, the magnitude of what it was hearing. He told the House that the Prince and Princess of Wales had decided to separate, that there were no plans to divorce, that the succession to the throne was unaffected, that the constitutional positions of the Prince and Princess were unaffected, and that the decision had been reached amicably. Every clause of that statement was carefully chosen to contain the constitutional implications, and every clause, in retrospect, was inadequate to the emotional reality. The marriage had not ended amicably. The separation was not a mutual decision arrived at through calm discussion. It was the institutional recognition that a marriage which had been dead in private for years could no longer be sustained in public without destroying the credibility of both the people inside it and the monarchy around it. That scene, Major at the dispatch box, the house quiet, the constitutional language wrapping a human catastrophe in parliamentary decorum, is one of the moments in this story that deserve to be understood in full, because it marks the crossing of a threshold. Before December 1992, the Wales marriage was still, in constitutional terms, a private family matter. After Major's statement, it was a fact of state. Parliament had been told, the country had been told. The separation was now part of the public record in a way that could not be retracted, managed, or gradually forgotten. The old model, deny, delay, contain, had failed completely, and the very act of announcing the failure in the House of Commons proved how completely it had failed. Each person inside the family experienced that moment differently, and those differences are the architecture of everything that followed. Elizabeth saw a crisis that had to be managed with the tools she trusted: patience, silence, the long game. She had survived the abdication of 1936, the Suez Crisis, the decline of empire, the modernization of the Commonwealth, and the erosion of deference over 4 decades on the throne. She believed the institution could outlast this. She was right about the institution. She was wrong about the cost. Charles saw the separation as the end of an unworkable arrangement he had long ceased to inhabit with honesty, and in that he was not wrong. But his relief, such as it was, existed alongside the knowledge that the public narrative now framed him as the man who had driven his wife to desperation. Diana saw humiliation and liberation in the same breath. The marriage was over, the pretense was finished. But she was now a separated Princess of Wales in a world that had no established script for what that meant or what she was allowed to do. Philip saw disorder, a family that had failed to hold together, and a system that had been weakened by the failure. The Queen Mother, 92 years old, saw one more proof that the modern world was unmaking the containments her generation had built and maintained. And William and Harry, 10 and 8 years old, became the silent center around which every adult in the family justified their own position. Diana would invoke the boys as the reason she had endured. Charles would invoke them as the reason for discretion. Elizabeth would invoke them as the reason to protect the institution that would one day be their inheritance. The boys themselves said nothing in public. They were children. They absorbed. The sustained fallout from the separation ran through 1993 and 1994, and it confirmed what the cleverest observers of the monarchy had already begun to suspect. Separation had not solved the problem. It had enlarged it. Diana, outside the marriage, but still inside the royal story, was more unpredictable, more publicly sympathetic, and in some ways more dangerous to the institution than Diana as a wife had ever been. She was still the Princess of Wales. She still lived at Kensington Palace. She still performed public engagements. She was still the mother of the future king. And she was no longer constrained by the daily pretense of a functioning marriage, which meant she was free to define her own public identity in the ways the palace could observe, but could not control. In December 1993, Diana announced that she was withdrawing from public life, a decision that was partly genuine exhaustion and partly strategic retreat, a way of reclaiming some measure of privacy in a life that had become unbearably exposed. The announcement itself generated enormous sympathy. The press treated it as a tragedy, the princess driven from the public stage by the very pressures the institution had failed to shield her from. Elizabeth's response was measured. The palace issued a statement of understanding. But inside Buckingham Palace, there was no consensus on what Diana's withdrawal actually meant or how long it would last. Some courtiers saw it as a welcome de escalation. Others saw it as a tactical move, Diana stepping back only to step forward again on her own terms, without the institutional constraints that had defined her public role during the marriage. They were right to be cautious. Diana's withdrawal from public life was neither permanent nor complete. By 1994, she was re-emerging, selectively, strategically, and with a sharpened sense of her own power. She chose her engagements carefully. She maintained her connection to the charities that mattered most to her. She was photographed leaving the gym, walking through London, living a life that was simultaneously private and intensely visible. The tabloids, far from losing interest, treated every sighting as news. The separated princess was, if anything, more fascinating to the British public than the married one had been, because her story was now open-ended. She was no longer playing a role that the institution had scripted. She was writing her own. Charles, meanwhile, was attempting to rehabilitate his image, a task made immeasurably harder by the publication of his private telephone conversations and the public's growing sympathy for the woman he had, in the popular narrative, abandoned. His advisor, Richard Aylard, orchestrated a careful campaign of rehabilitation that included a documentary, Charles, The Private Man, The Public Role, broadcast by ITV in June 1994, in which the prince spoke with apparent candor about his life, his work, and his marriage. In the course of that program, Charles confirmed that he had resumed his relationship with Camilla after the marriage had broken down. The admission was framed as honesty, a prince telling the truth about a painful situation. Its effect was more complicated. For some of the public, it confirmed what they had always suspected. For others, it was proof that Charles had been unfaithful and that Diana's account of the marriage had been accurate all along. The admission did not rehabilitate Charles. It reopened the wound. The institutional machinery ground on. Patrick Jeffson, Diana's private secretary, tried to navigate between her increasingly independent public identity and the palace's desire to maintain some measure of coordination. Robert Fellows, the Queen's private secretary, and, in one of those peculiarly British complications, Diana's own brother-in-law, occupied the impossible position of serving the sovereign while being family to the woman the sovereign was trying to manage. The courtiers communicated. The households communicated. But the communication was increasingly strained, increasingly tactical, and increasingly shaped by the knowledge that the two sides of the whale story were no longer operating from the same script. The monarchy's old methods, delay, discretion, non-comment, the assumption that silence would outlast scandal, were failing against a media environment that had changed faster than the institution's capacity to adapt. The tabloids were relentless. Television was relentless. And Diana, who had entered the family as a shy 19-year-old with no training in public life, had become, through sheer emotional intelligence and a decade of painful education, the most media-fluent figure the British monarchy had ever produced. She understood cameras. She understood timing. She understood that a single photograph of her looking vulnerable or compassionate could overwhelm an entire week of carefully managed palace communications. She did not always use this power deliberately, but she possessed it, and the institution knew she possessed it. And the knowledge changed the dynamics of every interaction between Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace from this point forward. By the end of 1994, the separation had created exactly what it was supposed to prevent. Two competing royal realities operating from the same family and the same institution, but serving entirely different narratives. One was centered on Buckingham Palace, the Queen, the official machinery of the monarchy, and the prince whose eventual accession it was designed to protect. The other was centered on Kensington Palace, a separated princess whose public identity was no longer defined by her marriage, but by something more powerful and less controllable: her capacity to make the British public feel that the monarchy contained at least one person who understood their lives. Those two realities could not coexist indefinitely. Someone would have to choose. Someone would have to force the question. And in November 1995, sitting in a room at Kensington Palace across from a journalist who had obtained access to her through deception she did not yet know about, Diana would do something that made coexistence impossible. She would speak directly to the nation, in her own voice, in her own words, on the most watched current affairs program in British television history. And the Queen, watching from Buckingham Palace, would understand at last that the woman she had spent 13 years trying to manage had moved beyond management entirely, and that the only remaining option was removal. The interview that changed everything did not happen by accident. It happened through deception, and the deception did not target Diana alone. It targeted the one person she still trusted to protect her from exactly the kind of exploitation she was about to walk into. But before that interview, before the camera, the studio, the 23 million viewers, and the words that would make divorce inevitable, there was a year in which every person inside this story moved further from every other, and in which Diana began to construct something the institution had not anticipated, a post-marital identity that was not diminished by the loss of the marriage but enlarged by it. Through the first half of 1995, the emotional geometry of the Wales saga grew more complex and more isolated at every point. Diana, still living at Kensington Palace, still bearing the title Princess of Wales, was operating increasingly outside the palace's orbit. Her public engagements were fewer, but more deliberately chosen. She was no longer performing the full round of royal duties. The factory openings, the regimental visits, the civic ceremonies that filled the diaries of working royals. Instead, she was focusing her public presence on the causes that gave her work moral weight: children's charities, hospice care, homelessness, the ongoing fight against the stigma surrounding AIDS. The shift was significant. She was moving from ornamental royalty to something closer to independent humanitarian authority, and the distinction mattered because it changed the source of her public legitimacy. She was no longer powerful because she was married to the heir. She was powerful because she could walk into a room full of suffering and make the people in it feel that someone with her visibility cared. That power did not depend on the palace, it did not depend on the marriage, and it could not be revoked by either. There was a paradox at the center of Diana's position in 1995 that the institution found almost impossible to resolve. She was still, formally, the Princess of Wales, a title that carried expectations of deference to the crown. But she was behaving increasingly as a figure whose authority came from somewhere else entirely. The traditional royal model required its members to draw their public significance from the institution. Diana was drawing hers from the public directly. She was doing what the monarchy had always feared most. She was proving that personal emotional connection could generate a form of legitimacy that rivaled, and in some settings surpassed, the constitutional kind. When Diana walked through a hospital ward and held the hand of a dying patient, no amount of institutional protocol could match the moral force of that gesture. The palace knew this. They could see the polls, they could read the coverage, and they had no mechanism for responding to it. Because the monarchy's entire operating system was built on the principle that institutional authority superseded personal charisma. Diana was disproving that principle every time she appeared in public. Her private life during this period was more turbulent than the composed public image suggested. She was lonely in a specific and corrosive way, surrounded by attention, starved of genuine intimacy, uncertain of whom she could trust, and increasingly aware that the people around her were as likely to be feeding information to the tabloids as protecting her from them. The paranoia that Martin Bashir would later exploit was not invented from nothing. It grew from real experience. Diana had been betrayed before, by staff members who talked to the press, by friends whose loyalty proved conditional, by the institution itself, which she experienced as a system that tracked her movements and managed her image without ever asking what she needed. The isolation was real, and it made her vulnerable in ways that a woman with more institutional support or a stronger personal network might not have been. Charles, during the same period, was engaged in his own careful reconstruction. The 1994 documentary had been a calculated risk. The admission about Camilla had cost him in the court of public opinion, but it had also, in the view of his advisors, cleared away the worst of the hypocrisy. He was no longer pretending the marriage had been something it was not. Richard Aylard, who had orchestrated much of the rehabilitation strategy, continued to manage the prince's public schedule with an eye toward rebuilding credibility through substance rather than image. Charles's charitable work continued to expand. The Prince's Trust was helping tens of thousands of young people each year. His environmental advocacy was gaining international recognition. His convening work on architecture and urban design was taken seriously by professionals in the field. He was in many ways a more serious and more substantive public figure than the tabloid narrative allowed. But the tabloid narrative was what the public consumed. And in that narrative, Charles remained the man who had betrayed his wife with another woman, while the wife suffered in a palace. No amount of charitable achievement could fully overwrite that story, while Diana was still generating a competing one. The competition between the two narratives, Charles's attempted rehabilitation and Diana's independent ascent, played out through the press with a ferocity that damaged both sides and exhausted everyone connected to them. Advisors on both sides briefed journalists. Stories appeared that could only have come from inside one household or the other. The tabloid editors, who understood perfectly that the Wales War was the greatest circulation driver of the decade, published everything they were given and went looking for more. The result was a media environment in which the monarchy's dirty laundry was not merely aired, but curated, packaged, and sold to a public that was simultaneously fascinated and appalled. The institution's dignity, Elizabeth's most carefully guarded asset, was being eroded daily by a conflict it could not end and could not control. Elizabeth, watching from Buckingham Palace, was managing what had become an impossible set of pressures. The monarchy's public standing had been damaged by the events of 1992 and the sustained exposure that followed. The institution needed stability. It needed the Wales situation to resolve itself in a way that protected the succession, preserved public confidence, and did not generate further scandal. Elizabeth's instinct was patience, the same patience that had carried her through 4 decades of crises, from Suez to the miners' strikes, from the decline of the empire to the modernization of the Commonwealth. She believed, as she had always believed, that the institution would outlast the individuals inside it, and that time would eventually reduce the intensity of the public's engagement with the Wales marriage. She was 69 years old. She had been queen for 43 years. She had seen crises come and she had seen them pass. She was not wrong to believe that the institution could survive this, but she was underestimating, perhaps for the first time in her reign, the force of the individual who was about to act, and the speed at which the media landscape was moving beyond the palace's capacity to control it. Philip's position had hardened. His letters to Diana had continued through the period of separation, direct, sometimes warm, sometimes blunt to the point of severity, always written in his own hand and signed with the kind of unsentimental affection that was the closest Philip came to tenderness. He was trying to do what the system had always expected its senior male figures to do: bring order to disorder, impose clarity on emotional chaos, remind everyone involved that the institution's requirements were not negotiable. In one letter, by several accounts, he acknowledged Diana's suffering and expressed genuine sympathy for her position. In another, he was blunter, questioning her choices, challenging her perspective, pushing back against what he saw as self-indulgence dressed up as vulnerability. Philip's letters were not cruel, but they were not what Diana needed. She did not experience his directness as clarity. She experienced it as pressure from a family that had never understood her and was now, in her reading, trying to control the terms of her exit as thoroughly as it had controlled the terms of her entry. The relationship between Diana and the Duke of Edinburgh was never simple, and to reduce it to antagonism would be unfair to both. Philip cared about Diana in his way. His way was the Windsor way, and the Windsor way had been the problem from the start. The Queen Mother, 95 years old, remained the silent standard. She made no public statements about the Wales situation. She did not intervene directly in the negotiations or the public warfare, but her presence in the family, her longevity, her composure, her embodiment of the idea that one simply endured whatever the world threw at the crown without complaint, without explanation, without the indulgence of public feeling, served as a constant, unspoken rebuke to the kind of emotional publicity that Diana had brought to the monarchy. The Queen Mother had survived the abdication, the Blitz, the death of her husband, and half a century of widowhood without ever once letting the public see her strain. She had done so not because she lacked feeling, but because she believed, with the conviction of a generation that had lived through total war, that public composure was itself a form of service. That was the model. That was what the family expected of its women, and Diana could not do it and would not pretend she could. Meanwhile, the boys were growing up inside the wreckage, and the wreckage was no longer private. William was 13 in 1995, old enough to read the newspapers, old enough to understand what was being written about his parents, old enough to feel the weight of what his future would require of him and the damage that his family's public disintegration might inflict on the institution he would one day inherit. Harry was 11, younger, less burdened by the expectation of succession, but no less affected by the emotional chaos surrounding him. Both boys were at Ludgrove, a preparatory school in Berkshire, shielded to some extent by the routines of boarding school life, but never fully protected from the reality that their parents' marriage had become the most public failure in British life. Diana was fiercely protective of them. Charles was attentive in his own way, but neither parent could give the boys what they most needed, which was for the war to stop. Into this already volatile and increasingly ungovernable landscape came Martin Bashir. Bashir was a relatively junior BBC journalist in 1995, not yet a household name, not a figure of established authority in the world of broadcast journalism, but a reporter with considerable ambition and an opportunity he was determined to seize at almost any cost. He wanted an interview with the Princess of Wales. The prize was enormous. Diana had never given a full sit-down television interview about her marriage, her life inside the royal family, or her version of events. Every major broadcaster wanted that interview. The question was how to get it. What Bashir did to secure access has since been established through the investigation conducted by Lord Dyson, a former Master of the Rolls, whose report was published in May 2021 after a lengthy and painstaking inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the interview. The findings were unambiguous and damning. Bashir had commissioned the creation of forged bank statements, documents that appeared to show payments from a national newspaper to a member of Diana's inner circle, suggesting that people close to her were being paid to provide information about her to the press. These fabricated documents were shown to Charles Spencer, Diana's brother, at a meeting in September 1995. The purpose was clear and calculated: to induce fear, to convince Earl Spencer that his sister was surrounded by people who were betraying her for money, and to position Bashir as the trustworthy journalist, the one honest broker in a world of treachery, through whom Diana could tell her own story on her own terms. Spencer, alarmed by what he was shown and protective of his sister, introduced Bashir to Diana. The access was granted, the mechanism was fraud. Bashir did not stop at the forged bank statements. The Dyson report found that he had made a series of other false claims to Diana and to those around her, claims designed to heighten her sense of vulnerability and deepen her distrust of the people and institutions she might otherwise have turned to for counsel. He suggested that her telephones were being tapped. He implied that the security services were monitoring her. He fed the paranoia that Diana already carried and made it worse, systematically and deliberately, because a woman who trusted no one was a woman who might trust him. The manipulation was not clumsy. It was patient, detailed, and tailored precisely to Diana's existing fears. And it worked. Diana did not know at the time that the documents were forged. She did not know that the sense of siege Bashir was cultivating, the feeling that she was being watched, monitored, and sold out by people she trusted, had been deliberately manufactured to make her more vulnerable and more willing to speak. What she knew was that she wanted to tell her story. She had wanted to tell it for years. The Morton book had been an indirect, mediated version, her words filtered through a journalist and insulated by deniability. What Bashir was offering was something different. Her face, her voice, her eyes, speaking directly to the British public without intermediary, without palace approval, and without the protective distance that had characterized every previous royal communication in Elizabeth's reign. The opportunity felt to Diana like liberation. It was in reality exploitation, though that truth would not emerge for another 26 years. The interview was recorded at Kensington Palace on the 5th of November 1995, a Sunday, in conditions of extreme secrecy. The BBC crew, reduced to the absolute minimum needed to operate the cameras and sound equipment, entered through a side entrance. Diana's butler, Paul Burrell, was involved in the arrangements. Her regular staff were given the day off or told she had other appointments. The recording was made without the knowledge of the palace, without the knowledge of Diana's own private secretary, Patrick Jephson, without the knowledge of Robert Fellows at Buckingham Palace, and without the knowledge of the BBC's own senior editorial management until the program was nearly ready to air. Bashir had operated outside every normal editorial safeguard. No senior editorial sign off on the means of obtaining the interview, no review of the forged documents, no disclosure to his own management of how access had been secured. The BBC, when it learned what it had, chose to broadcast rather than investigate. The prize was too great. The institutional failures would take 26 years to be publicly acknowledged. The program aired on the 20th of November, 1995, on BBC One's Panorama at 9 o'clock in the evening. Nearly 23 million people watched in Britain alone, making it one of the most viewed current affairs broadcast in the history of British television. The worldwide audience was estimated in the hundreds of millions. Diana sat in a simply furnished room at Kensington Palace, her makeup deliberately understated, the famous dark eyeliner that made her eyes the focal point of every frame, her voice steady, her composure remarkable given the magnitude of what she was doing. She was not hysterical. She was not vengeful. She was not performing breakdown. She was calm, articulate, and devastating. She spoke about the marriage. She spoke about Charles's relationship with Camilla. And she used a phrase that would become one of the most quoted sentences in the history of British broadcasting. There were 3 of us in this marriage, she said, so it was a bit crowded. The words were precise, measured, and impossible to misunderstand. They confirmed publicly what the country had suspected and the palace had spent years denying. The Prince of Wales had maintained a relationship with another woman throughout the marriage. His wife had known. The institution had done nothing to address it. But the interview went further than the marriage. Diana spoke about the monarchy and its distance from ordinary people. She spoke about her own struggles, the bulimia, the isolation, the feeling of being trapped inside a system that neither understood her nor wanted to understand her. She questioned whether Charles was suited to be king, not in those words exactly, but with enough implication that the meaning was unmistakable. She spoke about her desire to be a queen of people's hearts, a phrase that positioned her not as a rival to the crown, but as an alternative embodiment of what royal service could mean. And she said quietly but with absolute clarity that she would not go quietly. She would fight for her position and she would fight for her sons. The interview was simultaneously intimate and strategic, confessional and calculated, and that duality is part of what made it so difficult for the palace to dismiss. Diana was not simply airing grievances. She was reframing the entire story of the Wales marriage, and by extension, the story of the monarchy itself, in terms that placed her at the moral center and the institution at the moral periphery. The emotional register was exactly right for television, vulnerable but composed, honest but restrained, personal but universal. She was speaking as a wife, as a mother, as a woman who had been inside the most powerful family in Britain and found it wanting, and the public watching believed her. Not because she was necessarily telling the complete truth. All narrators are partial, and Diana was no exception. But because her emotional authenticity was so far removed from anything the monarchy had ever produced that it felt, by contrast, like the first honest thing anyone connected to the institution had ever said about what it was actually like to live inside it. For Elizabeth, the Panorama interview crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. A Princess of Wales had used a national broadcaster to publicly criticize the monarchy, to confirm the heir's infidelity, to question the institution's relevance to ordinary people, and to position herself as an alternative moral authority to the crown, all without seeking or receiving the Queen's permission, all without notifying any senior figure in the institution, and all in a format that maximized emotional impact and minimized the possibility of institutional rebuttal. Elizabeth had tolerated unhappiness. She had tolerated the Morton book, however painfully. She had tolerated the separation and the tabloid warfare and the leaked telephone recordings and the constant grinding exposure of the family's private failures. She had tolerated all of it because toleration was her method, because patience was her instinct, and because the institution's survival had always depended on its ability to absorb blows and endure. But Panorama was different. Panorama was not a leak or a rumor or a tabloid story that could be ignored. Panorama was a princess of Wales using television to bypass the monarchy entirely and speak directly to its subjects about its failures, in her own words, with her own face, on the most authoritative current affairs program the BBC produced. That was not unhappiness to be managed, that was a constitutional challenge. And Elizabeth responded accordingly. Charles saw fresh humiliation, public global broadcast into hundreds of millions of homes, and compounded by the knowledge that Diana's account, however partial, was believed by the overwhelming majority of the people he would one day be asked to rule as king. His advisors scrambled to assess the damage. Patrick Jeffson, who had not been told about the interview in advance, resigned as Diana's private secretary shortly afterward, his position untenable after the breach of trust the secret recording represented. Earl Spencer, who had facilitated the introduction to Bashir, would only learn years later that the documents shown to him had been forged, that the entire foundation of trust on which the interview had been built was fraudulent. That discovery, when it came, would transform the legacy of the interview from a moment of empowerment into something far more troubling, a moment of exploitation in which a vulnerable woman had been manipulated by a journalist using fabricated evidence to induce the very paranoia that made her willing to speak. But in November 1995, none of that was known. What was known was that the Princess of Wales had gone to war with the institution on national television, and that the institution, for the first time in the saga, was preparing to respond not with patience, but with action. 1 month after the broadcast, in December 1995, Buckingham Palace confirmed that the Queen had written to both Charles and Diana advising them to divorce. The word advising was carefully chosen. Elizabeth could not order a divorce, and the constitutional niceties required the language of recommendation rather than the command. But nobody inside or outside the palace mistook the letter for a suggestion. The Queen had decided. The marriage that had begun with 750 million people watching a cathedral wedding was going to end with a negotiation over titles, residences, and the custody arrangements for two boys who had already spent their entire conscious lives inside a family at war. The decision to move toward divorce represented a fundamental shift in Elizabeth's approach to the Diana problem. For 14 years, her method had been containment: absorb the difficulty, manage the fallout, wait for the situation to stabilize. Panorama had destroyed that method. Diana had gone over the institution's head and spoken directly to the nation, and the nation had listened. Elizabeth could not contain a narrative that was already in the public domain, confirmed by the princess herself on the most watched current affairs program in the country's history. Patience was no longer a strategy, it was a liability. The only remaining option was to define the terms of Diana's exit from the institution before Diana defined them herself. The diverging paths of the principal characters were now visible and accelerating. Elizabeth moved into administrative mode, the mode she understood best, the mode in which her authority was clearest. She was not going to let the divorce unfold through tabloid warfare and competing press briefings. She was going to manage it as a sovereign, through proper channels, with legal counsel, and with the institution's interest explicitly on the table. Her primary concerns were the succession, the boys, and the preservation of the monarchy's dignity, in that order. Diana's feelings, however real, were no longer the organizing principle of Elizabeth's decision-making. They had never been, perhaps, but the pretense that they might be was now fully abandoned. Charles's path through this period was defined by a tension between relief and dread. The divorce would free him from a marriage that had been a fiction for years, but it would also formalize, publicly and legally, the failure that the tabloids had been narrating since 1992. His advisors were already thinking about the long game, how to position the prince for eventual remarriage, how to rehabilitate his relationship with Camilla in the public eye, how to ensure that the heir to the throne did not arrive at his accession permanently defined by the wreckage of his first marriage. That rehabilitation would take years. It would require patience, discipline, and the slow accumulation of public goodwill through sustained charitable work and carefully managed public appearances. But the first step was clear. The divorce had to happen, and it had to happen on terms that did not further damage the crown. Diana's path was the most uncertain, and that uncertainty was itself a source of power. She did not yet know what a divorced Princess of Wales would look like, because no such figure had existed in modern British history. The title itself, Princess of Wales, was tied to the marriage, and the question of what she would be called after divorce became one of the most symbolically charged negotiation in the entire process. Diana wanted to remain Her Royal Highness. The palace wanted the style removed. That distinction might seem from the outside like an arcane matter of protocol. Inside the monarchy, it was everything. The style HRH was the marker of full membership in the royal system. To retain it was to remain, in the public and institutional imagination, a working member of the royal family. To lose it was to be formally repositioned as an outsider, still connected through her sons, still famous, still bearing the name Diana, Princess of Wales, but no longer carrying the institutional imprimatur that the style conveyed. Philip's position was characteristically direct. The marriage was over. The divorce should proceed. The institution should be protected. The boys should be shielded. His emotional investment in the nuances of Diana's post-divorce status was limited. He had watched the situation deteriorate for more than a decade, and his patience for the kind of emotional complexity that Diana brought to every interaction was, by this point, largely exhausted. He remained, as he had always been, the family's enforcer, loyal to the institution, loyal to the Queen, and unwilling to let personal sympathy override structural necessity. William and Harry occupied the most painful position of all. They were 14 and 11, old enough to understand what divorce meant, old enough to feel the public dimension of their family's failure, and young enough to be powerless to influence any of it. The custody arrangements would give them time with both parents. The practicalities would be managed by staff. But the emotional reality that their parents were not merely separating but divorcing, that their mother would lose her royal status, that the family they had known was being legally dissolved, was something no schedule or protocol could address. Diana's instinct was to draw them closer, to make herself the center of their emotional world, to compensate through fierce maternal presence for everything the institution was about to take from her. Charles's instinct was to provide stability through continuity. The routines of school, the rhythms of Balmoral and Sandringham, the quiet reassurance that the line of succession they belonged to would endure. Both instincts were real. Neither was sufficient. Earl Spencer, watching from Althorp, was beginning to understand that his sister's position was more precarious than it appeared. The public adored her. The press followed her every movement. But she was about to lose the institutional protection that, however inadequate, had provided a framework for her public life. A divorced Princess of Wales without HRH was a woman of enormous fame and almost no structural support. No office, no staff funded by the privy purse, no constitutional role, no institutional machinery to manage the relentless demands of global celebrity. Spencer could see what the palace could not or would not acknowledge: that removing Diana from the system would not make her less powerful. It would make her more exposed. An exposure for a woman who had been the most hunted figure in the British press for 14 years was not a neutral condition. It was dangerous. The problem was no longer whether the marriage could be managed. The problem was whether Diana could be removed from the institution without destroying the emotional connection between the monarchy and the British public, a connection that Diana, more than anyone else in the family, had built, and whether the woman who had spent 16 years as the most visible royal figure on earth could survive outside the system that had both sustained and suffocated her. The divorce, when it came, was an act of administrative precision applied to an emotional catastrophe. The negotiations ran through the first half of 1996, conducted through solicitors and intermediaries, with both sides represented by lawyers whose job was to translate 16 years of private anguish into the language of settlement terms, financial provisions, and the allocation of titles. The machinery of royal divorce had no modern precedent on this scale. The last comparable dissolution, the divorce of Princess Margaret from Lord Snowdon in 1978, had been managed quietly, with minimal public attention, in a different media age. The Wales divorce was being negotiated under the most intense public scrutiny any royal proceeding had faced since the abdication. The central battleground was the title. Diana wanted to retain the style Her Royal Highness. The palace wanted it removed. That distinction, 3 letters, an abbreviation that most people outside the aristocratic and constitutional world would struggle to define, was the symbolic fulcrum of the entire negotiation because it determined whether Diana would remain, in the eyes of the institution and the public, a full member of the royal family or be formally repositioned as an outsider. HRH was not merely a courtesy. It was a marker of status that governed how Diana would be addressed, how she would be received at official functions, and whether she would curtsy to other members of the family or be curtsied to. For the palace, removing HRH was a necessary act of constitutional housekeeping. A divorced princess should not carry the same institutional weight as a serving member of the royal household. For Diana, losing HRH was an act of erasure, the system stripping from her the last formal acknowledgement that she had ever belonged. The settlement was finalized on the 28th of August, 1996. Diana received a lump sum reported at approximately £17 million, along with an annual office allowance of around £400,000 to fund her private staff and charitable work. She was permitted to retain her apartments at Kensington Palace, apartments 8 and 9, the same rooms where she had tried to build a family life, where she had raised 2 boys through this disintegration of her marriage, and where she would now live as a divorced woman in the building that still housed other members of the family she was being separated from. She kept the title Princess of Wales, but she lost HRH. From this point forward, she was formally styled Diana, Princess of Wales, a distinction that Debrett's noted placed her outside the immediate royal circle. The comma mattered. The absent letters mattered. In the grammar of the British monarchy, where precedence and form carry the weight that emotion carries in ordinary life, the removal of HRH was the clearest possible statement that Diana was no longer one of them. The public, who had never cared much about the mechanics of royal protocol, continued to call her Princess Diana. The tabloids continued to put her on their front pages. The world continued to treat her as the most significant and most emotionally compelling member of the British royal family. The institution, which cared about nothing more than protocol, had made its point. Diana was out, but the institution's point landed only inside the institution. Outside it, in the world where public feelings shape public loyalty, Diana's status had not changed at all. Elizabeth had achieved what she set out to achieve. The marriage was dissolved. The succession was protected. The institutional boundary had been redrawn with legal precision. Charles was free to begin the long, slow process of rehabilitating his public image and eventually normalizing his relationship with Camilla in the eyes of a country that still viewed her with suspicion and in many quarters with hostility. The constitutional crisis that Panorama had threatened had been averted and or at least deferred. By every measure the palace used to evaluate outcomes, the divorce was a success. The system had absorbed the shock, applied its remedies, and restored order. But the paradox that the institution could not resolve, the paradox that would define the final year of Diana's life and the first days of the monarchy's worst crisis since the abdication, was already visible to anyone who cared to look. Stripping HRH did not reduce Diana's power, it changed its form. She was now less palace-bound and more mythic, less institutionally constrained and more symbolically potent. She was now less palace-bound and more mythic. She was no longer constrained by the daily obligations of a working royal, no longer answerable to the private secretaries and the diary managers and the courtiers who had governed her public life for 15 years. She was free to choose her causes, free to define her own schedule, free to accept invitations and decline them on her own terms, free to travel where she wished and speak to whom she wished without seeking permission from an institution that had never understood what it had in her and had now formally let her go. The monarchy had solved its administrative problem. It had worsened its symbolic one. Diana, without HRH, was not diminished. She was uncontainable. The proof came almost immediately, and it came from one of the most dangerous places on earth. In January 1997, Diana traveled to Angola with the Hallow Trust. a British charity dedicated to clearing the millions of landmines that remained buried across the country after decades of civil war. The trip had been planned before the divorce was finalized, but its timing gave it extraordinary symbolic force. The newly divorced princess, stripped of her royal status, walking into a war zone to do work that the institution she had left behind would never have sanctioned as part of an official royal program. Diana walked through a partially cleared minefield in Wambo, a city that had been devastated by fighting, wearing body armor and a protective visor, and the photographs, a princess in a flak jacket, walking alone through a landscape of buried death, the red markers of cleared mines visible in the dirt behind her, became some of the most powerful and most widely reproduced images of her entire public life. The visit was not ceremonial, it was not ornamental, it was not a ribbon cutting or a plaque unveiling or a walkabout through a crowd of well wishers. It was physically dangerous, emotionally demanding, and morally serious in a way that no amount of palace managed charity work could replicate. Diana sat with amputees, men, women, and children who had lost limbs to mines buried during a conflict most of the Western world had forgotten about. She held children in hospital wards who would never walk again. She listened to stories of devastation with the same instinctive empathy she had shown in London hospital wards a decade earlier. But now the context was not a British pediatric unit. It was a country that had been torn apart by war, and the woman walking through its wreckage was no longer a Princess of Wales in the institutional sense. She was something the monarchy had never produced and could never claim, a global humanitarian figure whose authority derived entirely from her willingness to be present in the places where suffering was most acute and most ignored. The Angola trip drew criticism from some politicians who accused Diana of meddling in political matters. The landmine issue was, at the time, a subject of active policy debate in several governments, but the criticism only amplified the story. Diana's advocacy helped galvanize international support for a treaty banning anti personnel landmines, which was signed in Ottawa in December 1997, 3 months after her death. She did not single handedly create the political will for the treaty, but she brought a level of public attention and emotional urgency to the campaign that policy documents and diplomatic negotiations alone could never have achieved. The Halo Trust has explicitly described the visit as transformative in shifting public understanding of the landmine crisis. That assessment is not sentimental, it is practical. Diana's presence in that minefield changed the way millions of people around the world thought about an issue they had previously been able to ignore. The monarchy, having formally removed her from its structures, could only watch as she demonstrated, with devastating clarity, what she could accomplish without them. The spring and summer of 1997 passed in a strange suspension between liberation and danger. Diana was living between worlds, no longer royal in the institutional sense, still royal in the public imagination, still the mother of the future king, still one of the most photographed and pursued women on earth. She was 36 years old. She was trying to build a life that the existing scripts of British public life did not accommodate. She was not a working royal. She was not a private citizen. She was not a politician or a diplomat or a traditional charity patron. She was Diana, and the world's interest in her showed no sign of diminishing, regardless of what the palace had decided about her formal status. She continued her charitable work with a focus that suggested she was building something permanent, not a temporary post divorce identity, but a genuine vocation. She maintained her connections to the causes that had defined her public life: children's health, homelessness, the campaign against landmines. She was in discussions about expanding her humanitarian work internationally. The woman who had once been mocked by parts of the establishment as an uneducated kindergarten assistant was, at 36, one of the most recognized and most effective advocates for humanitarian causes in the world. The irony was almost too neat. The institution that had tried to contain her, then tried to formalize her removal, had produced, through its own machinery of exclusion, a figure whose independent moral authority now exceeded anything the palace could generate through its official channels. The boys divided their time between their parents with the careful logistics of a custody arrangement managed by staff and solicitors. William, now 15, was at Eton, the school that Charles and Dinah had agreed upon together, one of the few cooperative decisions of the later years. He was becoming, by all accounts, a serious and thoughtful young man, already conscious of the weight of what his future would demand. Harry, 12, was still at Ludgrove, more openly emotional than his brother, more visibly marked by the turbulence of the family he had grown up in. Both boys spent parts of the summer with their mother and the parts with their father. Diana took them to amusement parks, to the cinema, to restaurants where they could eat without the formal constraints of palace dining, small acts of normal motherhood that felt, in the context of their lives, almost radical. Charles took them to Balmoral, where the rhythms of the Highland summer, the walking, the fishing, the outdoor life Philip had always championed, provided a different kind of structure. The boys were navigating between two emotional worlds as they had been doing for years. What neither parent could give them, and in what no amount of scheduling could provide, was the certainty that the adults around them had finished fighting. The divorce papers said it was over. The emotional reality said otherwise. In the last weeks of July and through August, Diana was in the Mediterranean, spending time with Dodi Fayed, the son of Mohammed Al Fayed, the Egyptian-born businessman who owned Harrods and the Ritz Hotel in Paris. The relationship attracted intense tabloid interest. Diana's romantic life after divorce was a subject the press considered fair game, and the paparazzi pursued her with a ferocity that had not diminished since the earliest days of her public life. Photographers followed her on jet skis, from boats with telephoto lenses that could capture images from hundreds of meters away. The pursuit was relentless, intrusive, and governed by a simple economic logic. A photograph of Diana with a new companion was worth tens of thousands of pounds to the picture desks. The details of the relationship with Dodi, its depth, its seriousness, its trajectory, remain contested and are ultimately private. What matters for this story is not the relationship itself, but the context in which it was being lived. Diana was being followed constantly and aggressively by photographers whose livelihood depended on capturing images of her, and she was doing so without the institutional protection that, however imperfect, had once provided some measure of security management, press liaison, and logistical shielding. The palace had removed her from the system. The paparazzi had not. The fame that the institution had helped create and then walked away from was still fully operational, and the woman carrying it was more exposed than she had ever been. On the evening of Saturday, the 30th of August, 1997, Diana and Dodi Fayed were in Paris. They had arrived from Sardinia earlier that day and checked into the Ritz Hotel, which was owned by Dodi's father. They had plans for a quiet dinner. The paparazzi had gathered outside the hotel, as they gathered wherever Diana went, a knot of men with cameras and motor scooters who tracked her movements across the city with the practiced efficiency of people whose income depended on knowing exactly where she was at every moment. Diana and Dodi attempted to have dinner at a restaurant, but were driven back to the Ritz by the intensity of the pursuit. They dined in the hotel's imperial suite instead. The evening was not what either of them had planned. It was not relaxed. It was not private. It was another night in which Diana's life was shaped by the presence of the cameras. She could not escape. At some point after midnight, in the early hours of Sunday, the 31st of August, a plan was made to leave the hotel through a rear exit and drive to Dodi's apartment near the Arc de Triomphe. Henri Paul, the deputy head of security at the Ritz, had been called back to the hotel to drive them. Trevor Rees-Jones, Diana's bodyguard, sat in the front passenger seat. Diana and Dodi sat in the back of a black Mercedes-Benz S280. The car left through the rear of the hotel at approximately 12:20 in the morning and drove along the Cour Albert Way, the riverside expressway that runs beside the Seine, heading west. The car was traveling at high speed. Whether that speed was a response to pursuing paparazzi, a decision by the driver, or both has been the subject of exhaustive investigation. What is not in dispute is this. At approximately 12:23 in the morning, the Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel and struck the 13th pillar at a speed that made survival almost impossible. Dodi Fayed was killed on impact. Henri Paul was killed on impact. Trevor Rees-Jones, the bodyguard, sustained devastating injuries to his face and body but survived. Diana was alive when the first emergency responders reached the wreckage. She was conscious by some accounts in the first moments. The French emergency services, the CMU, whose approach prioritized stabilizing patients at the scene rather than immediate transport to hospital, worked on her inside the tunnel and then in the ambulance. Her injuries were catastrophic, massive internal trauma, including damage to the pulmonary vein. She was taken to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, where a surgical team attempted to save her life. They could not. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Paris time, 3 o'clock in London, Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. She was 36 years old. There is nothing about that sequence of events that benefits from dramatization. The facts are sufficient. A woman who had spent 16 years as one of the most visible human beings on the planet got into a car in Paris shortly after midnight, and she did not survive the journey. She was the mother of two sons who were asleep in a house in Scotland. She had spoken to them on the telephone that evening. She had told them she would see them the next day. She was 36 years old, and the life she had been trying to build, and the life after the palace, the life after the title, the life in which she might finally have been allowed to be herself, ended in a concrete tunnel under a city she was visiting because the paparazzi had made it impossible to have dinner in a restaurant. The news reached Balmoral in the early hours of Sunday morning. The first reports, relayed through the British Embassy in Paris and the palace's communications channels, indicated that Diana had been in a serious accident and that Dodi Fayed had been killed. For a period of time, the accounts vary on how long, the family at Balmoral did not know whether Diana was alive or dead. Charles was told first. He contacted the British ambassador in Paris. He made calls. He waited. The confirmation came at approximately 3:30 in the morning, British time. Diana had died. The decision about when and how to tell William and Harry became, in those first terrible hours, the most important decision anyone in the family would make. More important than any press statement, any constitutional consultation, any discussion of funeral arrangements or public response. Charles told the boys himself early that Sunday morning before they could hear it from the radio or from staff or from anyone else. The exact words, the exact moment, the exact expressions on two boys' faces when they learned their mother was dead belong to William and Harry alone and have never been fully disclosed. What is known is that two children, 15 and 12, were told by their father that the person they loved most in the world was gone in a house in the Scottish Highlands, 700 miles from London, far from the cameras, far from the flowers that were already beginning to appear outside the gates of the palace their mother had called home. Elizabeth was 71 years old. She had been queen for 45 years. She had navigated crises that would have broken lesser institutions, the Suez humiliation, the erosion of empire, the miners' strike, the Falklands, the IRA's murder of Mountbatten, the fire at Windsor Castle, the annus horribilis, and the slow, grinding disintegration of her eldest son's marriage. She had managed all of it through the same method: absorb, contain, endure, maintain form. Now she was standing in a house in Aberdeenshire with two grieving grandchildren and a son who had just lost the mother of his children, and the method was about to fail her more completely than it had ever failed her before. Charles flew to Paris that Sunday afternoon with Diana's sisters, Lady Sarah McCorquodale and Lady Jane Fellows, to bring her body home. The flight was arranged through the Royal Squadron from Aberdeen. The logistics were handled with the brisk efficiency the palace brought to all such operations, the machinery of the institution performing its function even as the people inside it were moving through shock. At the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, Charles saw Diana for the last time. The sisters saw her. The coffin was draped in the royal standard, the standard of a family she had been formally removed from a year earlier, now reclaiming her in death. The plane returned to RAF Northolt, west of London, where the coffin was received with military honors late on Sunday afternoon. The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who had been in office barely 4 months, was at Northolt to receive the body. He had spoken earlier that day outside a church in his constituency and described Diana as the people's princess, a phrase that captured, with the instinctive political fluency that defined Blair's early premiership, the central fact of the coming week. Diana belonged to the public, not the palace, and it was the public, not the palace, that would set the terms of the morning. In London, the public response had already begun to outpace the institution's capacity to manage it. Flowers began appearing outside Kensington Palace on Sunday morning. Small bunches at first, placed against the railings by people who had heard the news and felt compelled to do something physical with their grief. By Sunday afternoon, the bunches had become arrangements. By Monday, the arrangements had become carpets, vast spreading fields of cellophane and stems and handwritten cards and photographs and soft toys and candles that covered the pathways and the grass and the walls and the gates until the area in front of Diana's home became a landscape of collective mourning so vast and so spontaneous that nothing in modern British public life had prepared anyone for it. The scent of decomposing flowers, sickly, sweet, overwhelming, hung over Kensington for days. The queues to sign books of condolence at St. James's Palace stretched for hours, winding through the streets in orderly, patient British lines, the people in them often weeping. Television coverage was continuous and emotionally saturating. The country was grieving in a way that was public, collective, demonstrative, and intensely emotional. The very register of feeling that the monarchy had spent decades keeping at arm's length, and that Diana had spent her adult life trying to teach it. And the royal family was at Balmoral, silent, absent, invisible. Elizabeth's instinct in those first hours and days was to protect William and Harry. The boys had just lost their mother in circumstances of terrible violence and overwhelming public exposure. They were children. They needed to be shielded from the full force of the public storm, given time to grieve privately, surrounded by family in a place that was physically and emotionally removed from the chaos in London. That instinct was not wrong. It was by any measure of decent parenting and basic human compassion entirely understandable. Elizabeth was acting as a grandmother. She was doing what any grandmother should do when her grandchildren are in shock and in pain. But she was also the sovereign, and the country was not looking for a grandmother. The country was looking for its monarch, for the visible, ceremonial, emotionally present head of state who could reflect the nation's grief back to itself and give it structure and meaning. The public expected to see the flag at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, but no flag flew there because the royal standard is only raised when the sovereign is in residence, and the sovereign was 700 miles away in Scotland. The public expected a statement of emotional substance, but the palace issued only brief formal expressions of shock, drafted in the careful institutional language that bore no resemblance to the raw, open, undisciplined grief flooding the streets of the capital. The public expected the royal family to come to London, to be seen, to grieve visibly and publicly, to stand among the flowers and the cards and the weeping crowds and acknowledge that something of immeasurable emotional importance had happened. The royal family stayed at Balmoral, and the silence that Elizabeth had always used as a tool of institutional management was being read by a country in mourning as something else entirely. It was being read as indifference. The gap between what the country expected and what the monarchy provided widened with every hour that passed. By Tuesday and Wednesday, the public mood had shifted from grief to anger. A specific focused anger directed not at the paparazzi, not at the driver, not at the circumstances of the crash, but at the royal family itself. The tabloids, which had spent 16 years profiting from Diana's image and contributing to the very culture of pursuit that had helped create the conditions for her death, now turned on the palace with the full force of their editorial pages. "Where is the Queen?" the front pages demanded. "Why is the flag not at half-mast? Why has the family not come to London? Why is the institution behaving as though the most beloved woman in the country has not just died?" The anger was visceral and it was dangerous. For the first time since the abdication crisis, the continued public legitimacy of the monarchy itself was in question, not on constitutional grounds, not on political grounds, but on emotional grounds. The country felt that the Queen did not feel what they felt. And in a monarchy that depended on the consent of feeling as much as the consent of law, that perception was existentially threatening. The criticism was not entirely fair. Elizabeth was genuinely trying to protect her grandsons. The absence of a flag was a matter of protocol, not callousness. The family's decision to stay at Balmoral was driven by a concern for William and Harry that was real and defensible and in private almost certainly correct. But fairness was not the currency of the moment. Feeling was. And the monarchy, which had built its entire operating model on the suppression and management of public feeling, had no reserves of emotional capital to draw on. It had spent decades communicating through formality, through protocol. through the careful calibration of image and distance. Now the country was demanding something the institution had never been designed to provide: raw, visible, immediate emotional honesty. The country was demanding, without knowing it, that the monarchy speak in Diana's language, the language it had spent 16 years trying to silence. By Thursday, the 4th of September, the pressure had become untenable. Senior advisors, including Blair's team at Downing Street, who understood the political danger more clearly than the palace's own courtiers, urged the Queen to return to London. The palace announced that the family would come south. The flag arrangements at Buckingham Palace were adjusted. A Union flag would fly at half mast over the building for the first time, a break with precedent that acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the moment and the extraordinary force of the public demand. The Queen and Philip drove from Balmoral. The family returned to London. Elizabeth walked outside Buckingham Palace and looked at the flowers, the cards, the photographs, the handwritten messages from a public that was mourning a woman the institution had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to contain. She stopped. She read the cards. She spoke to people in the crowd. And then she went inside to prepare the most important speech of her reign. The speech was scheduled for 6 o'clock on Friday evening, the 5th of September, the night before Diana's funeral. It would be broadcast live from the Chinese dining room at Buckingham Palace, a room chosen for its relative intimacy, a space that might, on camera, feel almost personal rather than grandly institutional. The window behind the Queen would show the crowd still gathered outside, a visual reminder that the public was watching not just through the television, but from the street. Elizabeth had to do 3 things at once: honor Diana, protect William and Harry, and restore the legitimacy of the crown. She had to speak as a grandmother and as a sovereign simultaneously. She had to express feeling without losing authority. She had to acknowledge that the woman the palace had administratively demoted, stripped of HRH, repositioned outside the royal circle, reduced in protocol to a comma and 3 missing letters, had been, in death, the most powerful emotional force the monarchy had encountered in the 20th century. After 16 years of trying to manage Diana as a family problem, an image problem, a marriage problem, and a constitutional problem, the Queen was about to stand in front of a camera and acknowledge what the country already knew: that Diana had been something else entirely, something the institution had never learned to accommodate and could no longer afford to deny. The Queen spoke at 6 o'clock on the evening of Friday, the 5th of September, 1997, from the Chinese dining room at Buckingham Palace. The camera was fixed, the room was still. Through the window behind her, the crowds gathered along the mall were faintly visible. A reminder, deliberate or not, that the public was watching from both sides of the glass. Elizabeth wore black. Her expression was composed but not closed. She looked, for the first time in the public memory of most of the people watching, like a woman who understood that the usual tools of her office were not equal to the moment, and that something else, something closer to ordinary human feeling, was required. She spoke for 5 minutes. She spoke of Diana's warmth, her kindness, her devotion to William and Harry. She spoke as a grandmother, the word she used herself, explicitly, in a formulation that was unlike anything she had ever permitted in a public address. "I want to pay tribute to Diana myself," she said. "She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness." She said she admired and respected Diana for her energy, her commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her 2 boys. She acknowledged that she shared in the nation's determination to cherish Diana's memory, and she said something that the institution she embodied had spent 16 years resisting, something that from any other monarch in any other week would have been unremarkable, but that from Elizabeth II, on the 5th of September, 1997, carried the weight of concession. She said that there were lessons to be drawn from Diana's life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. That sentence, lessons to be drawn, was the closest Elizabeth II came, in 45 years on the throne, to admitting that the institution had got something wrong. She did not say what the lessons were. She did not apologize. She did not abandon the measured, careful register that had defined every public utterance of her reign. But the concession was unmistakable to anyone who understood the grammar of royal communication. The Queen was not merely honoring Diana. She was acknowledging that Diana had represented something the monarchy had failed to provide, an emotional connection with ordinary people that the institution, for all its constitutional authority, had never been able to generate on its own. The woman who had lost the style of HRH barely a year earlier was, in death, dictating the emotional terms on which the sovereign herself must speak. The institution that had spent 16 years trying to manage, contain, discipline, and ultimately remove Diana from its formal structures was now being compelled to honor her in the very language she had pioneered, the language of warmth, of feeling, of visible grief. The speech worked, not because it was eloquent in the literary sense. That it was not. It was precise, restrained, and careful in ways that reflected the woman delivering it. It worked because it was enough. The country needed to see the Queen standing in London, not sheltering in Scotland. The country needed to hear her say Diana's name with something resembling warmth rather than institutional formality. The country needed to believe that the monarchy had registered, at last, the magnitude of what had happened and the depth of what the public felt. Elizabeth provided the minimum of each, and the minimum, from a sovereign whose emotional range in public had never extended beyond the narrowest band of composure, was received as something close to a revelation. The legitimacy crisis that had been building since Sunday morning was not resolved by the speech, but it was arrested. The monarchy would survive. Diana's death would not bring down the crown. Elizabeth had done what she had always done. She had endured, but this time endurance had required her to speak, however briefly, in a language that was not her own. It was Diana's language. And the fact that the sovereign had been forced to borrow it told the entire story of the preceding 16 years more clearly than any summary could. The funeral was held the following morning, Saturday, the 6th of September, at Westminster Abbey. It was designated a unique funeral, not a state funeral, which would have been constitutionally inappropriate for a divorced princess who no longer held HRH, but something larger and more emotionally charged than a private ceremony. The compromise reflected, one final time, the impossibility of fitting Diana neatly into any existing category. She was too important for a quiet farewell and too removed from the institution for a full state occasion. Even in death, she defied the system's classifications. The cortege passed through streets lined with people, an estimated 3 million along the route from Kensington Palace to the Abbey, and the sound that accompanied the gun carriage carrying Diana's coffin was unlike anything the capital had heard. Silence, broken by weeping, broken by the sound of flowers hitting the carriage, broken by applause as the procession passed. People had camped overnight to secure a position along the route. They had come from across Britain and from around the world. The emotional intensity was not performative. It was real, and it was vast, and it was an expression of something the monarchy had never fully understood about its own relationship with the public. That the people had formed an attachment to Diana that existed entirely outside the palace's jurisdiction, and that the grief they were expressing was not merely sympathy for a public figure, but genuine personal loss for a woman many of them felt they had known. William and Harry walked behind the coffin, a decision that has since been the subject of intense and legitimate debate about whether children of 15 and 12 should have been asked to perform their grief before the eyes of the world. Philip walked with them alongside Charles and Earl Spencer in a line of 5 that moved through the London streets with a formality that could not quite contain the rawness of what the boys were experiencing. The decision for the boys to walk was, by later accounts, not straightforward. There were discussions, there were concerns. Philip's presence beside William and Harry was understood by some as an act of solidarity, the grandfather walking with his grandson so they would not walk alone, and by others as one more example of the institution placing visible duty above the private needs of children in shock. Both readings contained truth. The boys walked, the world watched, and the image of those two figures, one tall and composed, the other smaller and visibly struggling to hold himself together, became one of the indelible images of the late 20th century, a photograph that would follow both men for the rest of their lives. Inside the Abbey, before a congregation of 2,000, royalty, heads of state, celebrities, charity workers, ordinary people Diana had befriended, Earl Spencer delivered a eulogy that functioned as something far more pointed than a brother's tribute. It was an indictment. Spencer's voice was controlled, but his words were sharp. He praised Diana's qualities, her warmth, her compassion, her instinctive and God given gift for connecting with people in pain. And he drew a line, barely veiled but unmistakable, between those qualities and the institution that had failed to protect them. He spoke of Diana's vulnerability and the confusion she must have felt when the people who were supposed to support her chose instead to manage her. He pledged, on behalf of the Spencer family, to continue the imaginative way in which Diana had been steering the upbringing of William and Harry, a sentence that carried within it the clear implication that the royal family's way was insufficient and that the Spencers intended to provide what the Windsors could not. The congregation inside the abbey did not applaud. The protocol of the setting did not permit it, but the crowds outside, listening on speakers in Hyde Park and along the funeral route, did. The sound of that applause, spontaneous, rolling building, entered through the open doors of Westminster Abbey and filled the nave. It was one of the most extraordinary moments in the modern history of British public life. The people literally answering the institution was the sound of their own feeling. The sound reached the family in the front pews. It reached the Queen. It reached the boys. Diana was buried that afternoon on an island in the ornamental lake at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire, not at Windsor, not in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, not in any burial ground associated with the House of Windsor. She was taken home, driven from London through streets lined with people who threw flowers on the hearse as it passed through the English countryside, to the estate where she had been born, where her father and grandfather were buried, where the Spencer name had been rooted for 5 centuries. The burial was private. Only the immediate family attended. The symbolism was inescapable, and it was final. After everything, the wedding, the marriage, the children, the title, the fame, the suffering, the interview, the divorce, the loss of HRH, the death, Diana's final resting place was Spencer Ground. The monarchy had claimed her for 16 years. In death, the Spencers claimed her back. The institution that had absorbed her, resisted her, separated from her, and finally removed her from its formal structures had no claim on where she would rest. She belonged at the last to the family she had come from, not the family she had married into. The aftermath of Diana's death rippled through the royal family and through British public life for years, reshaping relationships, reputations, and the institution itself in ways that are still being measured nearly 3 decades later. For Charles, the immediate period after the funeral was one of profound recalibration. He was a single father to 2 grieving sons, the heir to a throne whose legitimacy had been publicly questioned during the worst week of his mother's reign, and a man whose public reputation remained defined, in the eyes of much of the country, by the failure of his marriage and the suffering of his former wife. The rehabilitation that his advisors had been carefully constructing since 1994 had been set back by years, perhaps permanently, in the view of some commentators at the time. Charles retreated into the work that had always grounded him: the Prince's trust, his environmental campaigns, his architectural advocacy, and he focused with a dedication that even his critics acknowledged on being present for William and Harry in the years that followed. He asked the media to respect the boys' privacy. He took them on carefully chosen engagements when they were ready. He did not remarry quickly. The relationship with Camilla continued, managed with extraordinary caution. Years of gradual public exposure, carefully orchestrated introductions, the slow, patient building of familiarity that would eventually lead to their marriage in April 2005 at the Guildhall in Windsor, and decades later to Camilla's acceptance as queen consort upon Charles's accession. For Elizabeth, Diana's death and the crisis it triggered became a turning point, perhaps the only true turning point, in how the monarchy communicated with the public. The lesson she had acknowledged in the speech without naming was absorbed slowly but genuinely over the years that followed. The palace became incrementally more open, more willing to engage with public feeling, more conscious that the old model of distance and mystique was no longer sufficient in a media environment that demanded emotional legibility from its public figures. The changes were real, but they were measured. Elizabeth did not suddenly embrace the emotional register Diana had embodied. She remained, to the end of her life, a woman whose instinct was restraint, whose public persona was built on composure rather than confession, and whose greatest strength was the steadiness that came from never letting the country see her waver. But the institution shifted around her, subtly and permanently, in acknowledgement of what Diana's life and death had taught it: that a monarchy that could not speak the language of human feeling was a monarchy that risked losing the consent on which its survival depended. Elizabeth reigned for another 25 years after Diana's death. She died on the 8th of September, 2022, at Balmoral, the same house where she had sheltered William and Harry in the days after their mother was killed, the house from which the country had demanded she return. She was 96 years old. Her reign had lasted 70 years, and the institution she left behind was, in ways she would never have acknowledged publicly, a different institution from the one Diana had entered in 1981, changed, however reluctantly, by the collision with a woman it had never understood. Philip characteristically said little in public about the aftermath. He continued in his role as consort, as the family's enforcer and patriarch, as the man whose job was to keep the machinery running regardless of the emotional cost. He had walked behind Diana's coffin with two grandsons and his eldest son, and he had done so with the same stoic discipline he had brought to every public duty across more than half a century of service. Whatever he felt privately, he did not share it with the world. He served beside Elizabeth for another 24 years, the longest serving consort in British history, dying on the 9th of April 2021 at the age of 99 at Windsor Castle, just 2 months before what would have been his 100th birthday. His death came during the coronavirus pandemic, and the funeral was constrained by restrictions that limited the congregation to 30, a small massed gathering in St. George's Chapel that was, in its own way, as far from the vast emotional spectacle of Diana's funeral as could be imagined. The Queen sat alone in the chapel, separated from her family by the rules of the pandemic, a solitary figure in black. That image, Elizabeth alone, masked, grieving, became its own kind of emblem of endurance. The Queen Mother died on the 30th of March, 2002, at the age of 101 at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. She had outlived Diana by nearly 5 years and had maintained to the very end the composure that had defined her public life for 8 decades. She had never, in any public statement, addressed the Diana crisis directly. She did not need to. Her silence was its own statement. The statement of a woman who believed that the old way was the right way, that the monarchy survived through discretion and endurance, and that the emotional revolution Diana had brought to the institution was an aberration rather than a correction. Whether she was right about that is a question this story does not presume to answer. What is certain is that her death closed a chapter of the monarchy that stretched back to the reign of George V, and that the world she had inhabited, the world of absolute composure, of unquestioned deference, of public duty performed without visible cost, had already, by the time she died, been permanently altered by the woman who could not bear to live inside it. William and Harry carried the weight of their mother's death into adulthood in ways that became over the years increasingly visible and increasingly divergent. William absorbed the loss with a reserve that echoed his grandmother's temperament, contained, disciplined, directed toward the future rather than the past. He channeled his grief into preparation for the role he would eventually inherit. He studied at St. Andrews, married Catherine Middleton in 2011, and began building a public life that honored his mother's legacy of emotional accessibility while operating firmly within the institution she had struggled against. He spoke about Diana's death publicly but carefully, with the emotional discipline of a man who understood that his private pain existed inside a constitutional framework that would always make claims on how it was expressed. His approach to the monarchy, more open than his grandmother's, more emotionally engaged than his grandfather's, bore Diana's influence without being defined by it. Harry's grief took a different and ultimately more disruptive path. He has spoken publicly, in interviews, and in his memoir Spare, about the years of unprocessed trauma that followed his mother's death: the anger, the anxiety, the substance use, the feeling that the institution had failed to protect his mother and was now failing to protect him. His grief was more openly acknowledged, more publicly processed, more willing to name the damage, and less willing to accept the institutional constraints that his brother navigated with greater ease. His marriage to Meghan Markle in 2018 and their subsequent departure from royal duties in 2020 were, in Harry's own framing, driven in significant part by his determination not to allow the institution and the press to do to Meghan what they had done to Diana. Whether that framing was entirely fair to the institution, to the press, or to the complexity of the situation remained a matter of intense public debate. What was not in question was the directness of the line Harry drew between his mother's experience and his own choices. Diana's death was not for Harry a historical event. It was the organizing trauma of his life. Martin Bashir's role in the story acquired a devastating coda that took 26 years to reach its conclusion. The Dyson Report, published in May 2021 after an independent investigation commissioned by the BBC, confirmed what Earl Spencer and others had long suspected: that Bashir had used forged documents, sustained deception, and the deliberate cultivation of paranoia to secure the Panorama interview. The report found that the BBC had failed in its duty to investigate the circumstances of the interview when concerns were first raised in the late 1990s, and that a subsequent internal inquiry had been woefully ineffective. The BBC apologized. Bashir, who had by then left the corporation on health grounds, was found to have acted in serious breach of the BBC's producer guidelines. He was subsequently stripped of his BAFTA for the interview. The report raised questions that could never be fully answered: whether the interview, obtained through fraud, had accelerated Diana's isolation from the people who might have helped her, deepened the paranoia she already carried, contributed to the decisions that led to her divorce and the loss of HRH, and ultimately played a role in the chain of circumstances that led to her death. William, in a statement released after the report's publication, said the interview had made a major contribution to the fear, paranoia, and isolation that his mother had felt in the final years of her life. He said the BBC's failures had contributed to her fear, paranoia, and isolation, and that she had been failed not just by a rogue reporter, but by the leaders of the BBC, who turned a blind eye to the evidence. Harry issued his own statement, calling out the ripple effect of a culture of exploitation and unethical practices that had ultimately taken his mother's life. Neither statement mentioned Bashir by name. Neither needed to. The damage was done, and no report, however thorough, could undo it. The cultural afterlife of the Diana story has been extensive, and the adaptations that have reached the largest audiences illuminate how different eras and different sensibilities retell the same wound, finding in it new resonances, new sympathies, and new ways of understanding what the collision between Diana and the institution meant. The Crown, the Netflix drama created by Peter Morgan that ran for 6 seasons between 2016 and 2023, devoted significant portions of its 5th and 6th season to the Wales marriage, the Panorama interview, and Diana's death. The 5th season, released in November 2022, framed the Panorama interview as part of a broader crisis over the relevance of monarchy in modern Britain, with the institution struggling to understand a media landscape that had moved beyond its ability to control. The 6th season returned to Diana's final chapter, dramatizing the Paris crash and the royal family's agonized response at Balmoral, with a seriousness that sought to honor the emotional truth of the events, even where the specific details were imagined. Elizabeth Debicki portrayed Diana in those seasons with a stillness and an intensity that captured something essential about the real woman's combination of vulnerability, determination, and steel. The series reached tens of millions of viewers worldwide and introduced the story to a generation that had not been alive when Diana died, giving them a version of events that was shaped by dramatization but rooted in documented history. Kristen Stewart's performance in Spencer, Pablo Larraín's 2021 film, took a radically different approach. The film confined itself to a single Christmas weekend at Sandringham, a fictionalized version of Christmas 1991, and used this setting as a psychological pressure chamber for Diana's state of mind. The shooting parties, the formal dinners, the weighing of guests on arrival, the curtains drawn at prescribed hours, the surveillance of movement, and the policing of behavior. all rendered with a Gothic intensity that transformed the rituals of the royal household into instruments of confinement. Spencer was openly an imagining, not a documentary reconstruction, and it made no pretense of strict historical fidelity, but it captured something true and important about the emotional reality of Diana's experience inside the royal system: the claustrophobia, the surveillance, the relentless performance of a role that was consuming the person performing it. And it did so with the tools of cinema rather than journalism. Both The Crown and Spencer, in their different ways, reveal the same underlying truth about why this story endures. It is not merely a story about a scandal or a celebrity marriage. It is a story about the collision between personhood and institution, and the cost extracted from the person who refuses to disappear inside the role. Charles III is now king. He acceded to the throne on the 8th of September 2022, following the death of Elizabeth II at Balmoral at the age of 96, after a reign of 70 years, the longest in British history. The man who had been the reluctant groom in the most watched wedding of the 20th century, the publicly humiliated husband, the divorced father, the prince whose reputation had been shaped and scarred by the Wales saga across 3 decades, now wears the crown his mother wore for 7 decades. He is 77 years old. Camilla is queen, the woman who had been the enduring third presence in the Wales marriage, whose name Diana had spoken on Panorama to an audience of hundreds of millions, whose existence the palace had once treated as an embarrassment to be hidden, is now Queen Camilla, a title confirmed by Elizabeth herself in a public statement on the eve of her Platinum Jubilee in February 2022, the final and most significant act of institutional rehabilitation for a woman the palace had once tried to render invisible. William is Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. The title his mother once held, now carried by the son she raised. He is 43 years old. He lives at Adelaide Cottage on the Windsor estate with Catherine, Princess of Wales, and their 3 children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. He carries his mother's legacy in ways that are visible in his charitable work, in the Earthshot Prize he created, in his emotional openness relative to the generations that preceded him, and in his quiet insistence that the monarchy must engage with the public on terms that Diana would have recognized. He does not often speak about his mother at length. When he does, the restraint is audible, the careful cadence of a man who understands that his private grief is, and always will be, public property, and who has chosen to carry it with a dignity that borrows from both his parents, his mother's warmth and his grandmother's reserve. Harry lives in Montecito, California, with Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, and their 2 children, Archie and Lilibet. He has stepped back from royal duties. He has spoken publicly, in interviews, in his memoir, and in a documentary series about the impact of his mother's death on his life, his mental health, and his relationship with his family. He has drawn explicit connections between Diana's treatment by the press and the institution and the treatment he believes Meghan received. He retraced his mother's footsteps in Angola in 2019, walking through cleared minefields with the Halo Trust, the same charity Diana had visited 22 years earlier. The echo was deliberate and affecting. The connection was unbroken. His relationship with William, once close, publicly warm, united in grief, has fractured in ways that are painful to observe and that carry their own echoes of the generational damage this story has always been about. Earl Spencer remains at Althorpe, the estate that has been in his family for more than 500 years. Diana is buried on the island in the ornamental lake, a quiet place, surrounded by water, approached by a path that visitors can walk to but cannot cross. The estate is open to the public during the summer months. People still come. They come to see the house, the grounds, and the memorial to a woman who died nearly 3 decades ago and whose hold on the public imagination has not loosened. Althorpe is Spencer ground. Diana rests on Spencer ground, and that fact continues to carry a symbolic weight that no amount of time has diminished. After all the effort to fit her inside the machine of the monarchy, after the wedding, the marriage, the children, the title, the tours, the suffering, the separation, the interview, the divorce, the loss of HRH, her final resting place is not royal ground. It is the ground she came from. It is the ground that was always hers. This story is not really about whether Diana and Elizabeth liked each other. It is about two incompatible methods of monarchy colliding inside the same institution for 16 years, and the human wreckage that collision produced. Elizabeth's method was built on endurance through restraint, the belief that the sovereign survives by absorbing everything and revealing nothing, by letting the institution carry the weight that the individual cannot. Diana's method was built on identification through feeling, the belief that public life has value only when it makes the people watching feel seen, heard, and understood. For 16 years, the Crown tried to absorb, discipline, separate, and finally administratively downgrade the woman who had proved better than the institution at the one thing the institution most needed and least understood, making people feel that the monarchy was human. In the end, the monarchy survived. It survived because Elizabeth spoke, however briefly and however reluctantly, in Diana's emotional register, the register of warmth, of vulnerability, of visible grief. The sovereign who had built her reign on silence was compelled at the last to break it. And the woman who compelled her, the woman without HRH, the woman buried on Spencer ground, the woman who was 36 years old and the mother of two boys, is still, nearly 3 decades later, the most emotionally powerful figure the House of Windsor has ever produced. That is not a lesson. That is just a life.